Good times, good times. Have you ever heard of the Mongolian peasant principle? It was developed during a time when Joseph Stalin ruled Russia. Now we know that Stalin was not a very nice person. He made it a habit of sending his opponents off to prison, but before packing them off to the gulag, he made them confess to crimes that they never committed. It was rumored that Stalin had a psychologist working for him who could get a person to confess to just about any crime, regardless of whether they actually committed it or not. The psychologist said that the secret to his success was the Mongolian peasant principle. It works like this. Imagine a poor, shabby, unimportant man being brought into a large office that obviously is that of an important person. Everything in that office reeks of authority. The dark mahogany walls, the huge oak desk, the high leather chair, which in that high leather chair sits a big man in a uniform with rows of military medals across his chest. He sits there powerfully and proudly. The general then speaks to the shabby, uncomfortable visitor. I have a million rubles sitting right here on my desk. Here, you can see them. They are all yours. All mine, says the shabby, uncomfortable visitor. Yes, all yours on one condition. What's the condition? The man asked. You must press the small red button on my desk, says the general. What happens when I press the button? The person asked. An old Mongolian man drops dead. He dies? Yes, he dies at once without any pain. But why? What did he do? The man asked. That's none of your business, the general replies. Trust me, it's good for the people. All you need to know, at the moment that you press that button, a peasant dies, and you get 1,000,000 rubles. The man sits in silence for a long moment. Things become uncomfortable. Then he slowly reaches forward and presses the red button, and he takes the money and goes home. But for the rest of his life, he is haunted by the memory of what he did. He can't even bring himself to spend a cent of that ill-gotten gain. He's tormented day and night until he finally commits suicide. The 1,000,000 rubles are found underneath his bed. You see, Stalin's psychologist says, everyone has a Mongolian peasant in his life. Everyone has done something for which they feel great, deep guilt and shame. And I hunt around in their memory until I find it. And then once I found their peasant, I dangle it in front of their eyes until the person is withering in shame for being such a wretched human being. It's then that they'll confess to do anything to atone for their shame and guilt. Guilt is a very powerful emotion. It can cause us both physical and mental stress. Guilt can destroy us from the inside if we don't find forgiveness and healing. Which leads us to the story in today's gospel reading. On the surface, the story from Luke sounds like a typical Jesus healing. Jesus is in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He sees a woman there with a bent over back. He feels her pain. He calls her to him and heals her. And the leader of the synagogue goes insane because Jesus worked on the Sabbath. It all follows the same pattern of the other healing stories that we see. But there's something different about this one. What makes this one different is the nature of the woman's problems. Luke says she came to the synagogue with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. Not just a sickness, but a spirit of infirmity. Luke, the physician, seems to be trying to tell us that the problem that this woman faced was not so much physical as it was spiritual. I wonder, could he have been suggesting that a guilty mind, a burdened spirit, could result in a bent-over back? As I pondered that question, if a guilty spirit could result in a physical problem, I went to the internet and found that there is a neurological problem that the woman could have been suffering from. It's called conversion disorder. Conversion disorder is when a person experiences symptoms of a nervous system that is not tied to any medical condition. The symptoms are real and not imaginary, and they can affect the motor functions and our senses. There's a long list of physical symptoms that can be caused by extreme mental or spiritual distress. Things like fainting, seizure, paralysis, blindness, hearing loss, loss of speech, muscle weakness. The list goes on and on. For all of these, there isn't any real physical problem, but they do exist. For example, a person might be so afraid of what could happen if they leave their house that they don't even get out of bed. And as a result of not getting out of their bed, they become an invalid. Not because of sickness, but because of fear. You can see that the physical and psychological aspects of our well-being are intertwined. And in other places of the Gospel of Luke, Luke says that someone actually had leprosy, or had dropsy, or had an infirmity. But here the language is different. Luke writes, a woman came to Jesus with a spirit of infirmity, a spiritual problem that was making her sick. You know, I heard this week about a story about a man whose right arm was drawn up in such a way that it became almost entirely useless. One day, the man confessed to his pastor years earlier that he had hit his daughter in anger and injured her to the point that she needed medical attention. And it took her some time to heal. He told his pastor, "It was during this time that my arm began to draw up. I've hardly been able to use it since." But that was years ago. His daughter had forgiven him. But as the pastor listened to that story, he realized that what the man needed more than anything else was the assurance of God's forgiveness. So the pastor took hold of the man's right arm that was drawn up against his chest, and he prayed. He prayed with the man that he might be able to accept the truth that God could forgive him for all things, even causing such pain to his daughter. While he was praying, the pastor began to feel the arm relax. And within a few days, the man had fully recovered mobility to that crippled limb. To me, this seems like a clear example of that so-called conversion disorder. Once the man was relieved of his stress, his guilt, he was also relieved of his problem. And that makes me wonder that if the woman in today's text could have been suffering from a similar condition. But there's no way that we know. But just suppose that 18 years before she encountered Jesus, she had done something that caused her with such terrible guilt that she could no longer look anyone in the eye. Or perhaps even more likely, suppose 18 years earlier that someone had done something to her that caused her such terrible shame that she couldn't look anyone in the eye. It's not hard to imagine, is it? At first, it would have been a matter of her looking down at the ground, avoiding eye contact. But eventually, she might have begun to lower her head, and then her shoulders, and then her back. Until 18 years later, you would find her hobbling around town using a short walking stick to support her bent-over body. And all that time, she wouldn't have been making eye contact with those around her. She wouldn't have been letting people see her shame and guilt. We can't be sure why she went to the synagogue that day. She may have gone because she heard there was a man there who could heal her. But we just don't know, because Luke doesn't tell us. He simply says that she appeared, crippled as she was, and that Jesus saw her, took notice of her, and responded to her need. He released her from her sickness. It was her faith in Jesus' healing that brought her out of the shadowy darkness of her guilt. And isn't it like that for us? We all have a Mongolian peasant in our lives. We have that event or that thing that we have done that we are deeply ashamed of, and we wish that we hadn't done it to begin with. And deep down, we still might be carrying that guilt around, causing our backs to bend over from its weight. But the good news is it doesn't have to stay that way. It doesn't have to stay that way because we have a faith in a God that forgives, a God that loves us for who we are. Drawn up arms, bent over backs, and all. We serve a God of grace and forgiveness, a grace that is shown by an empty cross. We serve a God that by our faith brings us out of that shadowy darkness of guilt, of shame, again and again and again. All so that we can lead a life that is pleasing to God. Thanks be to God. Amen. Please stand as you